Simon, how are you? Hey. Hey, how's it going?
How are you? Did you get my phone call?
Yeah, Christine and I have.
Okay, good. Just wondered.
Look at these.
Thank you.
I know I sent you a copy of it.
Eric, how are you?
You guys have your copies?
I did. I do have it, yeah. Council Kennedy's down the hall with,
It's coming.
he is coming.
Yeah.
Is it 4 o'clock? Yeah.
All right.
Good afternoon, actually. Welcome to the zoning subcommittee. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Chairman Milanazzo.
Here.
Counsel Noon.
Here.
Counsel Kennedy.
Here.
3 present.
3 present. Thank you. The purpose of this afternoon meeting is to begin discussions of the zoning ordinance and or amendments to the ordinance related to the location of establishments which sell marijuana and to marijuana cultivation and distribution facilities. We're joined this afternoon by Eric Slagle from Development Services, as well as Christine McCall, and our city solicitor, Chris O'Connor, is here. We also have some representatives from the public here, and if we have time, we'll certainly recognize them to speak as well. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with members of the subcommittee, is to ask Eric and his team to give a presentation on the ordinance as that's being presented, and to touch a little bit about the timeline too, because I know that we have, I think it's July 1st date that we are working up against. So, Chair recognizes Eric Slagle.
Sure. Thank you, Councilor. What the council subcommittee and the council at large has in front of them is a draft zoning ordinance to regulate the recreational marijuana use in Lowell that was allowed in late 2016 by a special referendum at the state level. Lowell was what we call a yes community. That means the voters in Lowell voted yes on recreational marijuana. That has certain implications for the council going forward. The vote, I believe, was 57 to 42%. 57 in favor, 42% opposed. Very quickly, just to touch on the deadlines, the legislature acted in several ways on the referendum that was passed. They made some moderate changes. They extended some of the deadlines. But the long and the short of it is that come this June, the Cannabis Control Commission will begin accepting applications from marijuana providers to establish recreational use marijuana facilities around the state. And those licenses, I believe, as the chair mentioned, July 1st would be the date when those can go live. Right. So April 1st, Ms. McCall just reminded me. So April 1st is the date when applications can go forward, and July is the date when sales can start, assuming the facility is in existence at that time. The default is, if there isn't action by the locality in place, recreational marijuana sales are legal. And therefore, it's imperative on the council and the planning board to act in advance of that, so that there's something on the ground to have some structure to the recreational marijuana.
If I could, is the April 1st an actionable date, or is it July 1st?
July 1st is the actionable date for us.
Okay.
Because we are in the process of reviewing ordinances. A marijuana provider would not be able to get a positive determination from the city that their proposed location was legal, which is what they need to have to go before the Cannabis Control Commission. So the long and the short of it is we've done a lot of work working with the Cannabis Control Commission, reviewing the regulations. Christine has attended, and myself have both attended trainings and conferences that they've given regarding how the regulations are going to work. And the result of this work is the draft ordinance that the subcommittee and the council has in front of them right now. So I want to kind of very briefly go through the layout of the ordinance, but before that, I want to deal with a couple of ancillary issues that are non-zoning related, because I want the council to know that the subcommittee and the council as a whole to know that they are issues that have to be taken up. The first is that the legislation allows for a 3% local tax on all consumer sales in the locality. It's the position of the administration, we've talked to the city solicitor and the city manager about it, that should the council choose to adopt the ordinance that allows for recreational marijuana, at the same time we should adopt the 3% local tax to allow the municipality to tax those consumer sales of marijuana products. I think it's a no-brainer, but I think there may be some discussion on the council level about it. The plan, based on our conversations with the city manager, is to have the city solicitor's office draft up the local ordinance measure and have it on the same night that a proposed marijuana ordinance would be voted on, so the council can take it up all at once.
That 3%, as I understand it, was actually part of the Cannabis Control Commission recommendation or vote. Is that correct? That's at the state level that allows the locality to adopt it.
Yeah, if I could, the 3% sales, the dispensary would be retail sales. What about the cultivation centers? We have 2 cultivation centers. I mean, the product that's grown there, what about that? That's sold to somebody, and so does the 3% come in on that, or how is that?
The 3% is just sales to consumers.
It's retail.
So cultivation center, as we described a little bit later in the definitions, we're saying cultivation centers specifically are not allowed to do that. They are only allowed to sell to other marijuana uses. They are allowed to sell to a dispensary that could then sell products or seeds or plants. I mean, and that sale to the consumer would then be taxed, but there's no tax allowed on the cultivation pursuant to the legislation.
Okay.
The second non-zoning issue that we plan to put in front of the council at the same time is a limit on the number of marijuana facilities that is allowed in a municipality. The statute allows the city council, without a vote of like a separate vote on a statewide ballot, to limit the number of marijuana facilities to 5% of the number of alcohol licenses. 20% of the number of alcohol licenses in the municipality. That number right now is 22 for alcohol licenses. That means the city of Lowell could, in theory, limit it to 5, the number of marijuana facilities. That would include cultivation centers, medical use, laboratory, recreational use dispensaries,
Council Kennedy?
So if I could, so right now, we have 2 cultivation centers, right? We've got, and we have 1 dispensary.
That's correct.
So we would have the capacity for 2 more of one or the other. And we get a premium on the cultivation centers, right? In terms of taxes or income to the city for that?
Right, the host community agreements for the cultivation centers are structured a little bit differently than the one for the dispensary. So in the new regime, I think the council's gonna have to balance whether the 3% tax on dispensaries is gonna be a more bang for our buck for our license than the host community agreement on the cultivation centers. And it's a math problem, and it has to do with
Yeah,
whatever the money we're getting on a cultivation center and how much we think the sales are gonna be.
okay. But that's a question for down the road. That's not a question for this evening, right?
Right, so right now, as Councilor Kennedy mentioned, Patriot Care currently has a cultivation center that is up and operational and has been for quite a while, and a medical dispensary that is up and operational and has been for quite a while. And from the city's perspective, after conversations both internally with the police department, we haven't had any problems with either one of those facilities. They haven't shown up on the radar for any kind of negative issues. Be Well also has a host community agreement and a state license for a cultivation facility in Lowell. It is not operational. They have not, there's not an actual cultivation going on with Be Well at this time.
So they just have the building?
They have a building, and they have the state license and the local host community agreement.
When did they expect to be operational?
My conversations with Chuck Saba, who's here, who was one of the representatives of Be Well, indicate that they're talking about this building season, starting the construction, the fit out of the facility, but I don't know exactly when they're going to be
Do
operational.
you know, do they own or rent? Do they lease the building, or do they own the building? Own it?
I believe they own the building.
Yeah.
I believe that's their
Okay.
ownership.
You're welcome. Chair recognizes Council Noon.
Thank you, Chair. Eric, with regard to the Patriot Act, you said that they have cultivation center. Has that been in operation?
The Patriot Care's cultivation
Care, I mean.
has been in operation for quite
How
a while.
about the dispensary?
That's been in operation, the medical
So
dispensary.
the 3% tax has been applied to them already? or
No, the 3% tax is something that was in the recent legislation about recreational use and is allowed to be adopted by a municipality, but has not been adopted by Lowell yet, because again, the regulations, the final regulations just came out last Friday.
It's my understanding, if I could, it's my understanding that through the host agreement, we get about $75,000 from Patriot Care. In addition, they employ about 100 employees across their various locations.
Yes, so there are 2 agreements with Patriot Care, one agreement for the dispensary, one for their cultivation center. I believe it's either 75,000 or 100,000. I think it depends on how many dispensaries they have operational right now. That I'm not exactly.
The Patriot Care, their dispensary and cultivation center, are they in the same facility or are they
No,
separate?
they are 2 separate facilities.
Okay, and the rule call for that, a separate facility, is that correct?
In Lowell, we have determined, both in the way that we operated under the medical issue, the medical marijuana rubric, that they had to be located in separate facilities, and we have continued that into the proposed zoning here that would allow cultivation in our industrial districts, but wouldn't allow dispensaries in those industrial districts.
Since they're already in operation, they went before the zoning board, I assume, right? They go before the zoning, did they go before
They had
the
to get a
zoning?
special permit to open their medical,
Right.
their
So-
medical
so-
dispensary.
So probably a condition from zoning with regard to, a lot of questions probably been asked by zoning board members regarding securities and our operation. Is that?
Yes, and those issues are also dealt with on the DPH level. The medical facilities, the medical marijuana dispensaries are governed by the Department of Public Health regulations that include a significant portion of the regulations having to do with security. In addition, the Cannabis Control Commission regulations also have a large portion of the regulations that have to do with security, both of the facilities and of the transfer of product from one facility to another. That is dealt with in depth in that. But they did run their security, their security provisions were reviewed by the Lowell Police Department, and the Lowell Police Department had found them to be stellar. We haven't had any complaints about it.
What is the buffer between this dispensary or cultivation from, let's say, school or daycare? What's our requirement here in the city?
In the draft regulations, the draft zoning ordinance that's in front of you, that buffer is 500 feet.
Do you think that's far enough compared to other, say, city and town that also have a proposed zoning change with regard to dispensary or cultivation?
I think that that's a reasonable distance. I think that it mirrors the distance that the Department of Public Health placed in their original regulations of medical marijuana facilities to create the buffer from schools, daycare facilities, and that was 500 feet. The Lowell Board of Health actually lowered Lowell's buffer for medical dispensaries from 500 feet to 450 feet. But it's the belief of the administration that 500 feet is an appropriate number.
What, if anything, do you know for this existing facility? How far are they from, or any daycare and or school near any of these three facilities that have already been in place?
All of the facilities that have been approved thus far meet the DPH standards. So they're all and the Lowell standards. So they're all a minimum of 450 feet away. I know that the location of the medical dispensary right now is significantly further away. The cultivation center, I believe, is something like 490 feet away from an in-home daycare, but the cultivation facility does not have any public. The reason why the Board of Health was okay with reducing it to 450 was because the cultivation center doesn't allow any kind of public access. You can't get in there to the facility as a member.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Kennedy?
Why did they lower it from 500 to 450? Was it because they found that the cultivation facility was within 500 feet? Was that the point? I mean, that's...
I believe that it came up that there was a facility, there was a proposed location for a facility, and there was a daycare, like I said, 490 feet away.
Yeah.
And so there was a request to the Board of Health and to DPH as to whether or not the city of Lowell could reduce that from 500 to 450, and the Board of Health thought that that was a reasonable reduction.
Okay. And Pedro Kier is here. So can you tell me, what is the premium that's paid in terms of annually in taxes? Is it $75,000 or $100,000? And how was that arrived at? Was that just negotiated with the city manager, or how do we get to that point?
And if you could state your name and who you represent, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Bob Marison. I'm the CEO of Patriot Care. The host agreements, we have two host agreements, as Eric pointed out. So the dispensary agreement calls for an annual payment of $25,000 a year. The cultivation agreement basically provides for $25,000 per year for each dispensary that we are supporting. We have licenses in 3 locations in the Commonwealth. Currently, we only have operating Boston and Lowell, but we'll be opening Greenfield in about a month's time. So at that time, we will be paying on the cultivation agreement $75,000 per year. There's an additional provision in the host agreement that stipulates that to the extent that our after-tax profit, that we would make sure that up to 50, I'm sorry, that we would, if it would be the greater of sort of, that the total payments that we make in all of our host agreements would be the greater of what we've agreed to as the minimal amounts, or up to 15% of our after-tax profit after paying. We're subject to federal tax, so after that we would pay up to 15% of that to the communities. It would be distributed, amongst the communities that we operate in, because that's how we had structured it.
So the dispensary you pay $25,000 for the dispensary. I get that part of it, but the cultivation facility, how is that calculated again?
Okay.
Why does it matter?
Because the cultivation facility, well, as Eric indicated too, it's a fairly non-obtrusive location because there's no public access coming in and out, and people turn around in our driveway. But other than that, there's not really, nobody really knows we're there. So the way we had structured it, it was just sort of how it had come about. I don't remember how we came up with it, but because that facility was there needed to be some way to say, well, how do we figure out how to, we wanted to provide the community with something, and it came up that the best pathway to do that was to tie it to the number of dispensaries that we support of ours out of that cultivation facility. So because we had won licenses for 3, we said for each one we open, we will pay that annually. In addition to that, there are provisions in there for us to, we made $10,000 upfront payment as soon as we open, and then we made the $25,000 per year. There's other provisions in there that we're going to be providing other contributions to community organizations, which we've been doing. Dennis here serves on the opioid task force at the behest of the city manager. So we do quite a number of things beyond what's required under the host agreement, and that's kind of how it came about. And on top of that, we've well surpassed what the host agreement called for in terms of employment. We're over around 100 employees right now working in Lowell at both facilities, and our annual payroll right now is in excess of $3 million. And so we're very proud of that. And but that's kind of what the agreement's called for, significantly less than that.
So the premium that you pay right now, is $50,000 because you have Lowell and Boston?
$50,000 plus the $25,000 under the dispensary. So $50,000 under the cultivation, $25,000 under the dispensary.
Okay.
It will go up to $75,000 very shortly.
Okay. When is that other dispensary supposed to open?
Well, we just finished construction. We got our occupancy permits this week, and then we have to get the DPH to inspect. So once that opens, we will follow the way the host agreement works in terms of the timing of the next payment.
Summertime?
Well, we'll be open in April. No, we'll be,
Okay.
yeah.
If I could, while
I'll come back, kind of.
No, I want to ask a question, if you don't mind, while Bob's at
Yeah.
at the podium. Is there anything in this proposed ordinance and amendments to the zoning ordinance that is impacting the way you run your facilities here in Lowell now? And is there some talk of grandfathering the way you do business now versus what we're going to put in place? Is there anything that the zoning subcommittee should be aware of that might be conflicting with either the Cannabis Control Commission or what we're proposing?
Sure, well, that was one of the things I was going to bring up, is that there's a provision in the regulations that specifically talks about not allowing the co-location of marijuana facilities. So you couldn't have a cultivation center and a dispensary in the same location. You couldn't have a medical dispensary and a recreational dispensary in the same location. And I do know that Patriot Care has, at this time, my understanding is plans to try and actually co-locate a recreational facility at the same location that their current medical dispensary is located.
But the zoning amendment is suggesting that those be 1,000 feet apart, I believe.
Right, and so there's a disagreement between the administration and Patriot Care over how the legislation treats that. I think that the language that the legislation uses says that a local municipality can't prevent the conversion of a medical facility to a recreational facility. We interpreted that strictly, which means we can't prevent conversion, but we can prevent co-location. The Cannabis Control Commission's guidance says they think it should be interpreted more loosely than that, so that we shouldn't be able to prevent either a conversion or a co-location.
It also suggests you can't use zoning as a way to prevent it either. Is that correct?
Right, well, you can't, the legislation says you can't prevent it in any way.
Okay.
Whether by zoning or any other method, preventing, and there is currently a bill in front of the House, I think it's House Bill 1424, where the legislature specifically clarifies that. They do come down on the side of the Cannabis Control Commission and say that they believe that it should be should allow both a conversion from medical to recreational and a co-location of medical and recreational at the same location. Again, as I mentioned to Mr. Meyerson, this was a draft ordinance, and the city council is more than welcome to make whatever changes they think to it, either in anticipation of what the legislature does, or because they believe that.
They're grandfathered.
Yeah, that Patriot Care should be allowed to do both at the same spot. But that's, I've had multiple conversations with Bob about it. I think even if the council doesn't do anything, the legislature is likely to act on it. But even if they don't, the council certainly has the right to take that provision out or leave it in, and allow the city solicitor to opine on it. I know we've mentioned it to the city solicitor. I think the law department's in the process of reviewing it, that particular provision, and how the Cannabis Control Commission is
Thank you.
speaking to it.
Well,
You
just
can
to
continue.
finish, just to add on to what Eric was saying, so the Cannabis Control Commission, which regulates, the adult use program, as Eric indicated, did come out with guidance on 2 municipalities. There was a very recent, when we last spoke, I hadn't actually seen their recent guidance on this, Eric, so, I'm sure you have, but the guidance, this issue we're talking about, it really is only specific to Patriot Care, because the guidance doesn't say that you can't prohibit co-location of medical and recreational for new entrants. It doesn't say that at all. It just says that the guidance from and I can read it to you. I brought a copy. I can give you copies as well. The guidance basically interprets conversion differently than I think the way in which your team has interpreted conversion, and it basically it indicates that zoning bylaws and ordinances cannot be permitted to prevent the conversion, and they say conversion is either going from medical to adult use or to add adult use to medical, and I can give you a copy of their guidance. I didn't copy the whole thing, I just copied the relevant page, and I'd be happy to give it to the city clerk so you can have it. But the issue we're talking about really is only specific to Patriot Care, because we're the only one who has a dispensary in Lowell right now that would be subject to that conversion language. It wouldn't apply to anybody else that would be coming down the road, because they would be applying on, they would have to live by your statute as it is. So can I
Sure.
don't want to take up more of your time, but
Okay.
can I bring this up and should I
Sure.
give it to the city clerk?
We'll
Is
give that to the clerk, yes.
Oh.
Thank you, Bob. Chair continues to recognize Eric.
Sure. A final comment on that point.
Thanks.
A final comment on that point. Staff believes that it's important, regardless of how the council chooses to act on the specific case of Patriot Care as a pre-existing facility, that we maintain for any future uses that separation. One of the concerns that we did have was clustering. We were trying to prevent multiple marijuana facilities from grouping in the same location and creating some sort of detriment to the area by having a conglomeration of those. I'm not suggesting that would happen if Patriot Care co-located, but it was one of the reasons why we had the 1,000-foot buffer and why we put a co-location provision in there, is to try and keep that distance so that you wouldn't have like a line of pot shops along a particular street in Lowell and create some sort of negative
Okay.
impact from that.
So what Patriot Care is maintaining is that they're grandfathered. And what you're saying, you seem to be okay with their grandfather, but going forward, for anybody else, anybody that comes down the road now, would not be grandfathered. And so, right, is that it?
Well,
Or is that, have you got an objection to them being grandfathered?
Oh, it's just about the interpretation of whether or not the city council can take an action to prevent them from doing what they're doing. That's the disagreement that we're having. Our position is the city council, if they wanted to, could say, you can't have these things at the same location. And their position is, we're not allowed to say that the city council can't stop them from doing that. That's the disagreement. If the city council chooses that it's not important that we prevent Patriot Care from co-locating facilities, the point becomes moot, and you guys could just allow it by a minor language change. So it all comes down to kind of what the council believes is the appropriate response to an existing business.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman
Eric, with regard to the legislation that came about, was that forbidden co-location in the first place?
Again, so what the legislation states is that a local municipality cannot take steps to prevent a medical dispensary from converting to a recreational facility. That's the language in the legislation. The interpretation of that language is the disagreement, and I think that it's important, again, going forward, that we maintain some sort of spacing between these. That's a lot of what's in our zoning, is maintaining spacing for kind of negative impact purposes. I think it's certainly appropriate that the council make a determination as to whether or not it's something that they want to try and have the city apply to Patriot Care or not. And it may very well be that the legislature will make it that we couldn't even if we wanted to. Oh, sorry about that.
It has to be a reason why you can co-locate. Isn't that so? And that's why you have in this zoning amendment requesting that 1,000 feet separation.
Right.
Is that correct?
So the reason why we put that in there is because we had a concern about clustering and creating a district in Lowell where there are multiple marijuana facilities in close proximity and potential negative effects of having multiple facilities close together. That was an administrative decision to take that tack in this ordinance.
So there got to be some potential negative impact if we allowed even the Patriot Care at this point to co-locate it
Again, I would
and
say,
call it grandfather.
I would say that's up to the council to make that determination as to whether or not they want to take steps if they believe that's the case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So again, I want to kind of very quickly lay out some of the details in the proposed ordinance. So as you can see, the first page, I believe, has the definitions. We did a lot of work on the definitions to try to make sure that they mirrored or incorporated the specific definitions in the Cannabis Control Commission's regulations, so that there wasn't any confusion between one or the other.
If I could, just on the definitions, the marijuana testing facility,
Yes.
do those exist? I mean, is marijuana testing done outside of, say, a university or something? Are there actual facilities like that exist now in Massachusetts?
I think there aren't, and I think that's the Cannabis Control Commission and the people who are drafting the regulations see that as a kind of a problem and a challenge for the state, because universities that get federal funding are not going to be able to do this kind of testing without possibly jeopardizing their federal funding.
Okay.
And therefore, there's a belief that there's going to be a kind of a niche where a private entity would come in and create this sort of testing facility.
Okay. And so we have this in here just in anticipation that that's going to occur.
Absolutely. And if it does, we want to be able to say, we've already thought about it and we have it in place for it. So a registered marijuana use, that definition is intended to encompass anything you can do legally at the state level. So anything that falls under either the DPH regulations for medical marijuana or the Cannabis Control Commission's regulations for recreational marijuana. The marijuana cultivation facility for Lowell's purposes is a place where the public is not allowed and there's not going to be sale to consumers, but they will be growing or processing or any other kind of manufacturing or packaging of the marijuana products for transfer to another marijuana facility. In the case of Lowell, we have the two cultivation facilities. That's exactly how Patriot Cares work. There's a grow facility there. They have a commercial kitchen. It's set up to prepare both edibles and non-edible forms of marijuana products that are then transferred from their cultivation center to the dispensary. The marijuana testing facility, as Councilor Kennedy mentioned, is something that is identified in the Cannabis Control Commission's regulations as a use that they're going to license for independent testing. And we wanted to make sure that we had a category in our zoning if, in fact, such a use came and wanted to come into Lowell, that we could steer them in the way that council had already thought about it and thought about an appropriate place for them. Our position would be that's probably in a good kind of, I mean, it's biomedical kind of research. It would be a good thing to have in Lowell, and so we wanted to include it as a use that we were going to allow. The medical marijuana treatment facility, again, is an RMD, the registered marijuana dispensary under the medical provisions of the DPH regulations that gives, or sells marijuana products to consumers under the prescription formula that's been in place in Massachusetts for a few years. And the recreational and commercial marijuana dispensary is a place that kind of transfers and sells marijuana products without the need of a prescription and is governed by the Cannabis Control Commission. If you look at the very last page, which I think is one of the most kind of illuminating pages for our purposes, it lays out these 4 uses on our article of uses and talks about the districts in which they're going to be located. The map that we have included on the screen lays out the 2 general categories that they fall into, which is one that's allowed as a matter of right and one that requires a planning board special permit. The cultivation and testing facilities are the only 2 type of facilities that we would allow as a matter of right in Lowell. Those would be allowed in the industrial districts in the city. So if you look at the green, those are our industrial districts. That would be where we would allow a cultivation center without the need to get a planning board special permit or any other approvals from the city, with the exception of a host community agreement, which is required of any marijuana facility. They could find a location, get their host community agreement, get their license from the state, and open a cultivation facility or testing center under this framework in any of the industrial districts in the city. The yellow districts are places where other uses would be allowed by special permit. The cultivation and testing facilities would be allowed by special permit in the high-rise commercial district, in the regional retail district. We would allow a testing facility in the institutional district. That is in the event that there's somebody wants to be located near the university, and which is generally our industrial and institutional districts in the city, and wanted to have a facility. We thought that would be an appropriate place with planning board oversight to put a testing facility. So we allowed a testing facility by special permit in those districts. And they would also be allowed in the office park. We don't have very many office park districts, and there's only a couple that are very close to the city borders. We thought those would be appropriate for testing or cultivation if they had sufficient space. The medical treatment centers, which are the medical dispensaries, would be allowed by planning board special permit in the high-rise commercial district, in the institutional zone, and then the office park district. And the idea would be the same sort of thing. Those would be the appropriate districts that we think, with a planning board oversight, that you could legitimately have a medical dispensary that would be some of the appropriate places in Lowell. I think that kind of the most important thing for the council to take a look at is the recreational dispensaries. And this is kind of the adult use recreational marijuana dispensaries where it would be sold to the public. There are only 2 districts in the city that we allow that, both by special permit. The first would be the regional retail district, and the second would be the office park district. The regional retail districts are typically our larger scale retail districts. The very end of Rogers Street, I think there's a regional retail located around Plain Street, Chelmsford Street. There's one located on Middlesex over closer to the train tracks in the river, and there's one on Bridge Street. So there's a few regional retail districts located around the city, and that would be a place where we believe that a place like a recreational marijuana facility could be open and operated. That would be appropriate with larger parking and they have more access to kind of the larger thoroughfares in Lowell in case these become kind of high-traffic areas.
Counsel Kennedy?
The dispensary that we have now, the medical dispensary that Patriot Care runs, how is that zoned? That's a industrial zone, isn't it? Or is
I actually think they're in the high-rise commercial district.
High-rise?
Yeah,
Okay.
the high-rise commercial crosses the connector at that point, and their facilities in high-rise commercial.
I mean, I'm assuming that you thought long and hard about the regional retail district. I mean, I see this as being destination retail, so I don't think it really matters where they are. It doesn't matter that they be downtown. It doesn't matter that they be in a regional. You know, people are going to go where they are, no matter where that is.
I agree with you.
But you've given a lot of thought to be, well, I guess the planning board would still have to approve, right?
The planning board would still have to approve it, and they would have to get a special permit from the planning board. And I think the key piece is every one of these would require a host community agreement signed by the city manager. So the city manager could vet the locations. They would have to have a site in mind before they obtained a host community agreement. We thought that given the potential traffic impacts of a recreational marijuana facility, the regional retail would be kind of more appropriate than a place like the downtown where large-scale in and out with a lot of traffic might do more harm than good. And there's not sufficient parking typically for what we anticipate may be the volume of a facility like this. So we're going to have parking requirements that reflect the need to have sufficient parking space to allow for a large amount of consumers to access the recreational
Okay.
facility.
Thanks.
Though the map has a large number of districts, we have proposed conditions, which are again on the second page, which would limit the number of facilities above and beyond the overall limitation on the number that the council is allowed to do. And that is, as we discussed earlier, there would be no allowance of a facility within 1,000 feet of another facility. And the facilities would not be allowed within 500 feet of a public or private elementary school, middle school, secondary school, or any school or college serving a population where the student population is under 21 years of age.
Counsel Kennedy?
500 or 450?
Our zoning would be 500.
Okay.
The Board of Health regulations for medical marijuana dispensaries is 450.
Okay.
Medical marijuana cultivation centers is 450.
Okay. All right.
And just to be clear, all of the facilities that currently exist in Lowell would be grandfathered in their current location, and none of these distances would affect their
Okay.
current locations. They're allowed to continue as they currently exist.
If I could just mention, we're going to end in 5 minutes, if you don't mind, because we do have a 5 o'clock.
So there are, again, there are other kind of requirements. So you're required to get site plan review from the planning board, which would be more of an aesthetic kind of review, make sure that the landscaping is appropriate, the signage is appropriate, the layout of the building and the parking is appropriate. And then there would be a special permit, which would follow the special permit criteria in the zoning ordinance, which has to do with neighborhood character and the impacts on the neighborhood of traffic and all the other regular things that this planning board looks at for special permit granting. We think that this is the appropriate tack to take. That's why we've presented it to the council. We think this provides the allowance of our current businesses to stay in a legal fashion, the expansion of a reasonable number of additional businesses as the council chooses, while still preventing some of the negative impacts that we contemplate would be a challenge of, again, the clustering of facilities or having an overwhelming number of facilities throughout the city. So I think this kind of strikes the balance between the competing interests to have both the economic development and funding that this would allow, and also keep it in a reasonable scale and scope.
Thank you, Eric. The chair's going to recognize
I
Counsel Elliott.
know we're right up against the
right.
clock, but, and I apologize if you already discussed this, but is there a number, or what is the number of facilities, recreational dispensaries that, there's not a limit, is there, based upon the regulations that are about to be promulgated?
So the state allows a municipality to limit the number of marijuana facilities to 20% of the alcohol licenses that it's allowed to issue. We're allowed to issue 22 alcohol licenses, so we could limit it to 5.
We could. Can you explain what you mean, we could? That would be the limit, and then if,
We could limit it to 5. If the population of the city grew, obviously we could only limit it to, if we had 120,000 people, it would not be 5 anymore, it would be 6 or 7.
okay.
But we can limit it to whatever 20% of our alcohol licenses
And
are.
if we issued more licenses, then that number clearly would increase.
Right, so it's the number of alcohol licenses we're allowed to issue, not the number we actually issue. So we're allowed to issue 22, and that's based on the population of the city at the last census.
Okay.
It's 1 alcohol license for every 5,000
I
population.
thought the Modernization Act kind of removed some of those barriers. No, okay, I don't,
That's my,
I know it begins, well, we'll have more meetings.
We're actually going to meet next Tuesday at 5:30. The subcommittee
great.
is scheduled to meet
Okay,
next
good.
Tuesday at 5:30.
So just the green districts are,
the green districts are the industrial districts in the city where a cultivation center or a
Right.
testing facility would be allowed as a matter of right.
and the yellow.
The yellow districts are where 1 or more of the uses would be
Right.
allowed by special
And
permit
the
for
RR, okay.
the planning board. And again, I want to make it clear, and I think you were probably here when I said it, any use was going to require a host community agreement that's signed by the city manager. So there's going to be, in addition to anything that the city council passes, there's going to be vetting by the city manager's office of whether or not a location is appropriate to even start the process to get a special permit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Elliott. What I'd like to do now is wrap this zoning subcommittee up. We're going to continue next Tuesday, April 3rd at 5:30. I want to thank the presenters this evening and thank the public for being here as well. So the chair would entertain a motion to accept the report as a report of progress and adjourn to next week. So moved by Councilor Newman,
Motion.
seconded by Councilor Kennedy. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you.